The invitation. Sophia adjusted her simple scarf as a brisk wind swept through the crowded street. The bustling city never seemed to pause, even for a moment of reflection. The air was crisp, carrying the faint aroma of roasted chestnuts from a nearby vendor, mingling with the dull scent of concrete and exhaust. Sophia clutched her coat tighter, bracing herself against the chill. She had just finished her shift at the modest cafe where she worked, a far cry from the grand venues she used to frequent as part of her second job, catering for the elite. Sophia was a single mother to 8-year-old Emma, whose world revolved around crayons, stories of far-off lands, and a piano that stood silent in the corner of their small apartment. The piano was an old upright, worn but lovingly maintained, a relic of Sophia's own childhood. Once she had played with joy and abandon, the notes her escape from a world that seemed too vast and unyielding. Now, the piano was a silent witness to her struggles, its keys untouched for years. As she turned the corner toward home, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She fished it out and frowned at the unfamiliar number. Sophia hesitated, but ultimately answered. "Hello," she said, her voice cautious. "Miss Harper." A smooth, practiced voice replied. "This is James Ellsworth, personal assistant to Mr. Victor Darien. He has requested your presence at an upcoming event. It's a birthday celebration, next Saturday, at his estate." Sophia froze mid-step. Victor Darien. The name sent a shiver down her spine. She had catered at his parties before, standing quietly with trays of hors d'oeuvres and glasses of champagne as the wealthy guests laughed, danced, and flaunted their privilege. Darien was known for his extravagance and arrogance, a man who wielded power and wealth as weapons. His reputation for finding amusement in others' discomfort was legendary. "I don't understand," Sophia said, her voice faltering. "Why would Mr. Darien invite me?" There was a pause on the other end, as if the assistant was considering how much to reveal. "Mr. Darien was impressed by your dedication at his last event. He insists you attend as a guest, not as staff. You'll receive the formal invitation shortly." Before she could protest or ask more questions, the call ended. Sophia stared at her phone, her mind racing. What could Victor Darien possibly want with her? Her instincts screamed that this was not a gesture of goodwill, but she couldn't afford to reject such an invitation outright. She needed the catering work and couldn't risk offending someone as influential as Darien. That evening, as Emma colored at the kitchen table, Sophia paced the small living room. The glow of a single lamp illuminated their cozy but worn space. Her mind churned with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. "Mom." Emma's small voice broke through Sophia's thoughts. "Why are you walking around so much?" Sophia forced a smile and sat beside her daughter. "Just thinking, sweetie." Emma held up her drawing, a castle with a princess standing at the window, her long hair flowing in the wind. "Do you like it?" Sophia nodded, brushing a strand of Emma's auburn hair behind her ear. "It's beautiful, just like you." Emma beamed, and for a moment, the heaviness in Sophia's chest eased. But as Emma returned to her drawing, the weight of the upcoming events settled back over her. She knew she couldn't face Darien's world alone. Yet how could she shield Emma from whatever lay ahead? The week passed in a blur of work and restless nights. The formal invitation arrived the next day, delivered in a sleek black envelope with gold lettering. The instructions were clear: formal attire, arrive promptly at 7 p.m., and no additional guests. The latter condition sent Sophia's heart sinking. Emma would have to stay with their elderly neighbor, Mrs. Caldwell, who was always kind but frail. By Saturday, Sophia had managed to piece together an outfit from the thrift store, a simple black dress that fit well enough and a pair of heels that pinched her feet. She tied her hair back into a low bun, trying to look as polished as possible. Her reflection in the cracked mirror revealed a woman far removed from the carefree pianist she had once been. Emma hugged her tightly before she left. "Be brave, Mom," she said, her voice earnest. "Like the princess in my story." Sophia kissed her daughter's forehead, her heart swelling with love and fear. "Always, my love." The Darien estate was a sprawling masterpiece of luxury. Sophia arrived in a taxi, the grandeur of the property striking her with an almost physical force. Towering gates opened to a long driveway lined with meticulously pruned trees, their branches twinkling with fairy lights. The mansion loomed ahead, its many windows glowing warmly against the evening sky. As she stepped out of the car, a valet appeared to take her coat, and a butler escorted her inside. The interior was even more breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over marble floors, and the air was rich with the scent of roses and expensive cologne. Guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled, their laughter a melodic hum that contrasted sharply with Sophia's rising unease. "Ah, there you are," a voice said behind her. Sophia turned to find Victor Darien himself approaching, his tailored suit impeccable and his expression unreadable. He was a striking man, with sharp features and an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Mr. Darien," Sophia said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Victor's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm so glad you could join us. You look charming." The words felt like a test, and Sophia resisted the urge to shrink under his gaze. "Thank you for the invitation," she replied, her tone polite but firm. Victor's gaze lingered for a moment before he gestured toward the grand piano in the corner of the room. "I couldn't help but notice your fascination with the piano at my last event," he said. "Do you play?" Sophia's breath caught. The question felt like a trap, and the sudden attention from nearby guests only heightened her discomfort. "I used to," she said carefully. "It's been a long time." Victor's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Perhaps you'll grace us with a performance later," he said, his tone light, but carrying an unmistakable edge. Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Sophia stood frozen, her mind racing. This wasn't a party, it was a stage, and Victor Darien had just cast her in a role she didn't want to play. A performance in the shadows. Sophia moved through the grand room like a shadow, trying to remain unnoticed. Her instincts, honed from years of catering for the elite, guided her steps. Keep to the edges, stay small, avoid the eyes. Yet tonight, this strategy seemed futile. Victor Darien had marked her, and his words about playing the piano loomed over her like a storm cloud. The air buzzed with polite laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. Waitstaff moved like clockwork, balancing silver trays laden with hors d'oeuvres and champagne. Sophia's breath quickened as she felt the weight of curious stares. Guests whispered behind jeweled hands, their gazes darting toward her before quickly averting. She could feel their questions even if they didn't voice them aloud. Who is she? Why is she here? Her hand tightened around the thin stem of her champagne flute. She had taken it as a prop, hoping to blend in with the crowd, but the bubbles sat untouched. The soft strains of a live string quartet floated through the room, adding to the atmosphere of opulence. The grand piano sat in the corner, its glossy surface catching the light like a dark, unspoken promise. Victor had disappeared, but Sophia could still feel his presence, an intangible force orchestrating the evening's events. She caught her reflection in one of the towering mirrors that adorned the walls. Her simple black dress, while elegant, felt out of place among the sequins and silk of the other guests. Her hair, tied back in a neat bun, seemed too plain compared to the elaborate updos and cascading curls around her. Despite her efforts to blend in, she felt exposed. As the evening wore on, Sophia found herself standing near the edge of the grand hall, her back pressed against a cold marble column. She scanned the crowd, searching for Victor. She needed to know where he was, what he was planning, but he was nowhere to be seen. "Enjoying yourself?" Sophia turned sharply, startled by the voice. A young woman stood beside her, holding a glass of red wine. She was strikingly beautiful, with auburn hair swept into a loose chignon and a dress that shimmered like liquid gold. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were sharp and inquisitive. Yes," Sophia lied, forcing a polite smile. "It's a lovely event." The woman extended a manicured hand. "I'm Elena Carrington." And you are? Sophia Harper, she said, shaking Alina's hand. She hesitated, unsure how to explain her presence. I work in catering. Mr. Darien invited me as a guest tonight. Alina raised an eyebrow. Her interest piqued. How curious. Victor doesn't usually invite employees. Sophia's cheeks burned, but before she could respond, Alina leaned in conspiratorially. Don't let him intimidate you, she said in a low voice. Victor enjoys his games, but he's not as clever as he thinks. Just don't give him the satisfaction of seeing you squirm. Sophia blinked, taken aback by Alina's candor. Before she could reply, Alina straightened, her smile bright, and practiced once more. Good luck, Sophia, she said before disappearing into the crowd. The evening stretched on, and Sophia's unease grew. The guests seemed to relax, their laughter becoming louder and freer as the champagne flowed. But for Sophia, the tension only mounted. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, that Victor was biding his time. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden clinking of a glass. The room fell silent as Victor Darien stepped onto the small stage at the far end of the hall. He looked every bit the commanding host, his tailored suit immaculate, his presence magnetic. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth and resonant. Thank you for joining me tonight to celebrate another year of life, prosperity, and... His gaze flickered briefly to Sophia. The unexpected. Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Victor smiled, but there was an edge to it, a glint of something sharp and dangerous in his eyes. As many of you know, I like to keep my gatherings entertaining. Tonight, I have something special planned. Sophia's stomach twisted. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that she was about to become the centerpiece of his spectacle. Victor gestured toward the grand piano. We have among us tonight a guest with a hidden talent. Someone who, I believe, has not graced these keys in far too long. His eyes locked onto Sophia's, and she felt the air leave her lungs. Sophia Harper, he said, his voice carrying across the room. Would you do us the honor of playing for us? A murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. All eyes turned to Sophia, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. She felt the weight of their stares, their collective expectation pressing down on her like a physical force. For a moment, she couldn't move. Her mind raced, her heart pounding so loudly, she was sure everyone could hear it. She wanted to say no, to refuse outright. But the thought of Victor's smirk, of him reveling in her fear, stopped her. Sophia straightened her spine, forcing herself to breathe. She would not give him the satisfaction. Of course, she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. She stepped forward, the crowd parting to let her pass. The piano gleamed under the chandelier's light, its polished surface reflecting her pale, determined face. Sophia sat down on the bench, her hands trembling slightly as she placed them on the keys. She closed her eyes, blocking out the room, the stairs, and Victor's piercing gaze. For a moment, she hesitated. It had been years since she played. What if she couldn't do it? What if she made a fool of herself? But then she thought of Emma, her daughter's innocent faith in her, her bright smile as she said, "Be brave, Mom." Sophia clung to that image, letting it steady her. She pressed the first key. The sound was soft, almost tentative, but it resonated through the room, cutting through the heavy silence. She began to play, her fingers finding their rhythm as muscle memory took over. The melody was haunting and beautiful, a piece she had learned as a child, but never forgotten. As the music swelled, the room seemed to shrink. The chatter ceased, and the weight of the stairs lifted. Sophia poured herself into the music, letting it carry her away from the oppressive grandeur of the estate, away from the cruelty of Victor Darien's game. The final notes hung in the air, trembling before fading into silence. For a moment, the room was utterly still. Then, a single clap broke the silence, followed by another and another, until the hall was filled with thunderous applause. Sophia opened her eyes, her breath catching as she looked out at the crowd. The expressions she saw were not mocking or skeptical but awestruck. People were smiling, some even wiping tears from their eyes. Her gaze found Victor. He stood at the back of the room, his expression unreadable. For once, his mask of confidence had slipped. He looked shaken. Sophia rose from the bench, her hands trembling slightly. She had done it. She had faced Victor's trap and turned it into something beautiful. But as the applause swelled around her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Shifting shadows. Sophia stood near the piano, the applause still echoing in her ears. Her fingers tingled with the memory of the keys, and her heart raced, not from fear anymore, but from something deeper, something unfamiliar. Pride. The crowd's reaction had been genuine, their admiration unmistakable. For a brief moment, she had reclaimed a part of herself long buried under years of struggle. But as the applause waned and conversations resumed, Sophia's thoughts returned to Victor. She scanned the room, searching for the man who had thrust her into this spotlight, but he was nowhere to be seen. Her gaze lingered on the doorway at the far end of the hall, the one Victor had disappeared through after her performance. Something about his reaction had unsettled her. The confident, calculating man she had come to expect had looked almost vulnerable, shaken. It was a look that didn't align with the Victor Darien she had heard about, the man who reveled in control and cruelty. "Mom." That was amazing. A small, familiar voice called out. Sophia turned to see Emma, her face alight with joy. She had managed to sneak through the crowd, her eyes wide with admiration. Sophia knelt, pulling her daughter into a tight hug, her earlier unease momentarily forgotten. "Thank you, sweetheart," Sophia whispered. "I'm glad you're proud of me." Emma nodded, her auburn hair brushing Sophia's cheek. "You were like a princess playing for her kingdom." Sophia laughed softly, her heart warming at her daughter's enthusiasm. But the moment of reprieve was short-lived. She could feel the weight of the evening pressing back down on her, the whispers from the crowd, the unresolved tension with Victor. As the evening wore on, Sophia kept to the periphery of the room, avoiding prolonged interactions. Guests approached her sporadically, offering compliments and asking polite questions about her musical background. She answered cautiously, always keeping her responses brief. Despite the praise, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was still a part of some elaborate game Victor had devised. It wasn't until later, when most of the guests had begun to leave, that Victor reappeared. He stood near the edge of the room, his hands in his pockets, watching her with an expression she couldn't decipher. Sophia steeled herself and approached him. She couldn't leave without confronting him. Whatever this was, she needed to know. "Mr. Darien," she said, her voice firm, but quiet. Victor looked at her, his sharp features softened by something that almost resembled regret. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, with a nod, he gestured toward the door that led to one of the mansion's quieter sitting rooms. "Let's talk," he said. Sophia hesitated but followed. The sitting room was a stark contrast to the grandeur of the main hall. It was smaller, cozier, with dark wood paneling and a crackling fireplace. Victor poured himself a glass of whiskey from a decanter on a side table, then offered her a drink. She shook her head, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Victor took a slow sip, then set the glass down. For a moment, he stared into the fire, his expression distant. "I owe you an explanation," he began. His voice lacked the arrogance she had grown accustomed to, replaced by a quiet gravity. Sophia said nothing, letting the silence hang between them until he was ready to continue. "When I invited you tonight," Victor said, turning to face her, "I had every intention of humiliating you." The admission hit her like a blow, though it was hardly surprising. She clenched her fists, anger flaring in her chest, but she forced herself to stay composed. "But then you played," he continued, his voice faltering slightly, "and it reminded me of something I thought I'd lost forever." Sophia frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. "My late wife, Celeste. She loved music, especially the piano. She used to play every evening, filling this house with life. When she died, the music stopped, and so did I." His voice cracked, and for the first time, Sophia saw the man behind the mask. He looked raw, exposed, as if peeling back the layers of his polished persona had left him vulnerable. "I've been cruel," Victor admitted, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Not just to you, but to everyone. It was easier than confronting the emptiness, easier to hide behind my wealth and arrogance than to face the fact that I've been living in a shell of my former self." Sophia crossed her arms, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to believe him, to see this as a moment of redemption, but another part of her, the part that had endured his manipulation, remained wary. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Why did you single me out?" Victor hesitated, then met her gaze. "Because you reminded me of her. The way you looked at the piano that night, like it was calling to you. I saw a glimpse of who I used to be, and I hated it." Sophia swallowed hard, her anger softening but not dissipating. "So you decided to punish me for it?" Victor nodded, his expression pained. "I thought I could control the narrative. Make you small so I wouldn't have to confront what I'd lost. But I was wrong." The room fell silent, the crackling of the fire the only sound. Sophia's mind raced, grappling with his words. She didn't know if she could forgive him, but she also couldn't deny the sincerity in his voice. Finally, she spoke. "What do you want from me, Mr. Darien?" Victor shook his head. "I don't know. Redemption, maybe. A chance to make things right. But I won't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it." Sophia studied him, searching for any hint of deception. But all she saw was a man standing on the edge of something, unsure of whether to take the leap. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady. Victor nodded, accepting her response without protest. "That's all I can ask." Sophia left the estate that night with a mix of emotions swirling inside her. The applause, Victor's confession, the haunting beauty of the music. It all felt surreal, like a dream she couldn't quite wake from. When she arrived home, Emma was fast asleep, her small hand clutching a stuffed rabbit. Sophia sat at the edge of her bed, staring at the piano in the corner. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a relic of the past. It felt like a promise. She pressed a key, the soft note echoing in the quiet apartment. Then another and another, until a melody began to form. As she played, tears streamed down her face, not of sadness, but of release. She wasn't playing for Victor, or the guests, or even for Emma. She was playing for herself. Echoes of change. Sophia woke the next morning to the faint sound of birds chirping outside her window, a rare melody in the otherwise chaotic hum of the city. Sunlight streamed through the thin curtains, illuminating the modest room she shared with Emma. Despite the exhaustion that clung to her body, a strange lightness lingered in her chest. The previous evening felt like a surreal dream, a standing ovation, Victor's startling confession, and most importantly, the rediscovery of something she thought she had lost forever. Her music. As she stretched and sat up, her eyes drifted to the piano in the corner. It seemed to gleam with newfound life, no longer a shadow of the past, but a bridge to something more. She stood, crossed the room, and ran her fingers lightly over the keys. The notes were still warm in her memory, and she found herself longing to play again, to let her fingers explore the melodies that had been locked inside her for so long. But Emma's sleepy voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mommy," she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "Are you going to play again?" Sophia smiled, turning to her daughter. "Maybe later, sweetheart. How about some breakfast first?" Emma nodded eagerly, and Sophia set to work preparing a simple meal. As they ate, Emma's chatter filled the room with warmth. She spoke about her school, her friends, and of course, how proud she was of her mother's performance. "Everyone was looking at you like you were magic," Emma said, her wide eyes sparkling. "You were the best part of that whole big house." Sophia laughed softly, her heart swelling with love for her daughter. "You're my best part, Emma," she said, reaching across the table to ruffle her hair. Later that afternoon, Sophia's phone buzzed with a message. She hesitated before picking it up, her heart sinking slightly as she saw the sender, Victor Darien. The message was short and formal. "Sophia, I would like to discuss an opportunity with you. If you are willing, please meet me tomorrow afternoon at the Music Conservatory on 7th Avenue. I'll understand if you decline. Victor." Sophia's stomach tightened. The idea of meeting him again filled her with apprehension, but the mention of the conservatory piqued her curiosity. Why there? What did he want now? After a moment's hesitation, she replied with a simple, "I'll be there." The next day, Sophia found herself standing in front of the grand entrance of the city's music conservatory. The building was a masterpiece of architecture, with intricate carvings adorning its facade and tall windows that gleamed in the midday sun. She hadn't been here since she was a teenager, accompanying her mother to a recital where she had first dreamed of becoming a professional pianist. The thought made her chest tighten. That dream had been abandoned long ago, replaced by the realities of survival and raising Emma. But now, as she stood before the conservatory, the faint echo of that dream stirred within her. Victor was waiting inside the main hall, his demeanor markedly different from the cold, commanding figure she had come to expect. He greeted her with a nod, his hands clasped in front of him. "Thank you for coming," he said, his tone subdued. Sophia crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "You said you wanted to discuss something." Victor nodded and gestured for her to follow. He led her down a long corridor lined with photographs of past performances and into a smaller, more intimate recital room. A grand piano stood at the center, its polished surface gleaming under the soft lighting. "I've been thinking about what you said," Victor began, turning to face her, "about why I singled you out. And I realized I owe you more than an apology." Sophia raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "What could you possibly owe me?" Victor's expression softened. "A chance." She frowned, confused. "A chance for what?" "To step back into the world you belong in," he said simply. "To play, to perform. To reclaim the part of yourself you've buried for too long." Sophia's breath caught. "You don't know anything about me." Victor gestured toward the piano. "I know enough. And I know talent when I see it." Her instinct was to reject him, to walk away and leave his offer behind. But something stopped her. The piano, standing there like a challenge, its presence pulling at a part of her she had tried to ignore. "I'm not interested in your charity," she said finally. "This isn't charity," Victor replied firmly. "It's an opportunity. There's a recital here in 2 weeks, a fundraiser for underprivileged children. They need performers, and I've already spoken to the director. They'd be thrilled to have you." Sophia hesitated, her thoughts swirling. She wanted to say no, to turn her back on Victor and everything he represented. But then she thought of Emma, of how her daughter's eyes had lit up as she watched her play. And she thought of herself, the girl who had once dreamed of filling rooms with music, of reaching people with the stories her fingers could tell. "What's in it for you?" she asked, her voice laced with suspicion. Victor smiled faintly, though there was no malice in it. "Redemption, perhaps, or maybe I just want to see something beautiful again." Sophia studied him, searching for any sign of deception. But for the first time, she saw none. She saw a man who had lost as much as she had, someone who was trying, however imperfectly, to find his way back. Finally, she sighed. "I'll think about it." Victor nodded, his expression unreadable. "That's all I ask." Over the next few days, Sophia couldn't shake the idea of the recital. She found herself drawn to the piano in her living room, her fingers itching to play. One evening, after Emma had gone to bed, she finally gave in. Sitting down at the piano, she let her hands hover over the keys before pressing down, the familiar sound filling the room. The music came hesitantly at first, her fingers stiff and unsure. But as the melody unfolded, she felt the years melt away. She played piece after piece, the notes flowing from her like water, each one a release of the emotion she had kept bottled up for so long. When she finally stopped, tears streamed down her face. But for the first time in years, they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of hope. A week later, Sophia found herself back at the conservatory, seated at the grand piano in the recital room. Victor stood at the back, watching silently as she rehearsed. He didn't interrupt, didn't comment. He simply listened. When she finished, he stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "You're extraordinary," he said quietly. Sophia looked up at him, her heart pounding. "I'm not doing this for you, Victor." He nodded. "I know, and that's what makes it worth doing." For the first time, she allowed herself to smile. The recital was still days away, but in that moment, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just playing for the crowd or for redemption. She was playing for herself, and for the future she wanted to build for Emma. The recital. The night of the recital arrived faster than Sophia had anticipated. The conservatory buzzed with life as guests streamed into the main hall, their laughter and conversations mingling with the faint strains of a string quartet warming up on stage. Sophia stood in the wings, dressed in a simple but elegant black gown that Victor had insisted on providing. Her palms were clammy, and her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the bustle around her. The past week had been a whirlwind of preparation. Between practicing at the conservatory and balancing her work and responsibilities as a single mother, Sophia barely had time to process the enormity of what she was about to do. Playing at a recital wasn't just about performing. It was about reclaiming a part of herself she had buried long ago. But now, as the moment approached, doubt gnawed at her resolve. She peeked out from behind the curtain, scanning the audience. The room was filled with elegantly dressed patrons, their faces alight with anticipation. In the front row, Emma sat next to Mrs. Caldwell, her small hands clutching a program. Her wide-eyed excitement brought a brief smile to Sophia's face, but it quickly faded when her gaze landed on Victor. He sat near the center, his posture relaxed, but his expression intense. It wasn't the usual smug confidence she had come to associate with him. It was something else, something almost reverent. Sophia tore her eyes away, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "You've got this," she whispered to herself, though her trembling hands betrayed her uncertainty. The lights dimmed, and the chatter in the audience quieted as the director of the conservatory stepped onto the stage. After a brief introduction and some words about the fundraiser, he gestured toward the wings. "And now, it is my great pleasure to introduce a very special performer. Please welcome Ms. Sophia Harper." Applause filled the hall as Sophia stepped onto the stage. The spotlight felt blinding, and for a moment, she faltered, her nerves threatening to overwhelm her. But then she saw Emma, clapping wildly and beaming with pride. The sight grounded her, giving her the strength to move toward the piano. She sat down, letting her fingers rest lightly on the keys. The room was silent, the audience waiting. Closing her eyes, Sophia took a deep breath and began to play. The first piece was Chopin, a delicate and haunting nocturne. The notes flowed from her fingers like water, filling the hall with a melody that seemed to hang in the air. As she played, Sophia felt the tension in her body ease. The piano was no longer an object of fear or uncertainty. It was an extension of herself, a voice she had silenced for too long. The audience was captivated. Every note drew them deeper into the music, their faces reflecting the emotions Sophia poured into her performance. She felt their energy, their connection to the music, and it fueled her. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. The second piece was more challenging, a fiery, passionate sonata by Beethoven. The dramatic shifts in tone and tempo required every ounce of focus and skill she possessed. Her fingers danced across the keys with precision and power, each note resonating with the force of her emotions. The music spoke of struggle and triumph, of loss and redemption. It was a story she knew intimately, and as she played, she felt as though she were telling it not just to the audience, but to herself. The final chords rang out, powerful and resonant, leaving the room in stunned silence before the applause erupted. Sophia rose from the bench, her chest heaving, as she took in the standing ovation. She saw tears in the eyes of some audience members, their expressions a mixture of awe and gratitude. Emma was on her feet, clapping so hard that Mrs. Caldwell had to steady her. Sophia's gaze drifted to Victor. He wasn't clapping, but his expression was anything but cold. He looked, moved. His eyes met hers, and for a fleeting moment, she saw something that startled her. Respect. After the performance, the reception was held in the conservatory's grand foyer. Guests mingled, sipping champagne and exchanging compliments about the evening's performances. Sophia stood near a corner, holding a glass of water as a steady stream of attendees approached her with praise and congratulations. "You were magnificent," an elderly man said, shaking her hand. "Truly inspiring." "Thank you," Sophia replied, her voice humble but warm. As the crowd around her began to thin, Victor appeared, his presence commanding as always. But tonight, he seemed different, softer, almost hesitant. "Sophia," he said, his voice low. "May I speak with you?" She nodded, though her guard was still up. He led her to a quieter corner of the room, away from prying eyes and ears. "That was—" He paused, searching for the right words. "I don't have the vocabulary to describe it. You were extraordinary." Sophia studied him, unsure of his intentions. "Thank you," she said cautiously. "But I don't think you brought me here just to compliment me." Victor smiled faintly. "You're right. I wanted to tell you that tonight wasn't just about the recital. It was about giving you a platform. Yes, but it was also about giving myself a chance to change." Sophia tilted her head, her expression skeptical. "Change?" He nodded. "I've spent so much of my life focused on wealth, power, and control. But when I saw you play at my party, it reminded me of who I used to be, who I could be again." Sophia crossed her arms, her voice sharp. "Do you think one recital makes up for all the times you've hurt people, Victor?" "No," he admitted, his gaze steady. "But it's a start, and I'm willing to do the work, if you'll let me." She hesitated, her emotions warring within her. Part of her wanted to dismiss him, to walk away and never look back. But another part of her, the part that had seen glimpses of his vulnerability, wanted to believe he could change. "Fine," she said finally, "but don't expect forgiveness overnight." Victor smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "I wouldn't dream of it." As the evening wound down, Sophia found herself alone with Emma in the empty recital hall. The grand piano stood silent on the stage, its presence a reminder of the night's triumph. Emma tugged at her hand, looking up at her with bright, curious eyes. "Mommy, are you going to play again soon?" Sophia knelt down, cupping her daughter's face in her hands. "I think I will, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft but certain. "I think I will." Emma hugged her tightly, and as Sophia held her daughter close, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just the end of a performance, it was the beginning of something new, the beginning of harmony. The days following the recital were a whirlwind of emotions for Sophia. The acclaim she received from the performance had been overwhelming. But more than that, it had reignited a part of her she thought was gone forever. For years, her world had been confined to survival, working long hours, shielding Emma from hardship, and pushing her own dreams to the background. Now, for the first time, she felt the stirrings of possibility. The response from the recital was far greater than Sophia had anticipated. Calls began coming in. Small concert venues, charity events, even a local community center asking if she would teach a workshop. The praise felt surreal, but with it came a sense of responsibility. Each opportunity was a chance to shape a new future, not just for herself, but for Emma as well. But not everything was easy. The weight of Victor Darien's words still lingered in her mind. His admission of guilt, his desire to change. Could she trust him? She hadn't expected his apology, much less his sudden transformation. And yet, there was something undeniably sincere about the way he had looked at her after the recital, a quiet vulnerability she couldn't ignore. One afternoon, Sophia found herself sitting at her kitchen table, staring at a small stack of invitations and offers. Emma sat across from her, doodling with crayons and humming softly to herself. "Mommy," Emma said, looking up from her drawing. "Are you going to play the piano again at a big place?" Sophia smiled faintly, brushing her fingers over one of the envelopes. "Maybe. People want me to. But it's a lot to think about." "Why?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "You're really good. Everyone clapped so much." Sophia laughed softly, her heart swelling with love for her daughter. "It's not that simple, sweetheart. Playing takes time, practice, and it's a little scary sometimes." Emma tilted her head, her expression serious. "But you were brave at the big house. You can be brave again." Her words hit Sophia with a quiet force. Emma's belief in her was unshakable, and it reminded her of the strength she had shown during the recital. Maybe she could be brave again. Maybe she could build something new. Later that evening, as Sophia played softly on the old upright piano in their living room, there was a knock at the door. She paused, her fingers lingering on the keys, and glanced at Emma, who was curled up on the couch with a book. "Stay here, sweetheart," Sophia said, rising to answer the door. To her surprise, Victor stood on the other side, holding a folder and wearing a surprisingly casual jacket over a button-up shirt. He looked almost out of place in the modest hallway of her apartment building. "Victor," Sophia said, her voice cautious. "What are you doing here?" "I didn't mean to intrude," he said, his tone quieter than usual. "But I wanted to talk to you. May I come in?" Sophia hesitated but eventually stepped aside, allowing him to enter. Victor's eyes scanned the small, cozy apartment, lingering on the piano in the corner. He smiled faintly, as if seeing it gave him some sort of confirmation. "This is nice," he said, setting the folder on the kitchen table. "Much warmer than my place." Sophia crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "What do you want, Victor?" He gestured to the folder. "I've been thinking about the recital. About you. You've got talent, Sophia. Real talent. But more than that, you've got a story. People need to hear it." Sophia frowned. "What are you talking about?" Victor opened the folder, revealing a detailed proposal. "I want to help you launch a career, not just as a pianist, but as someone who inspires others. Your story, your journey, it's something people can connect with, and I think it could change lives." Sophia stared at the papers, a mix of awe and suspicion swirling inside her. "You think people want to hear about me? A single mom who waited tables and played piano in her living room?" Victor nodded. "Yes, because it's real. Because it's powerful. You're proof that life doesn't end when things get hard. You're proof that people can rediscover themselves." Sophia shook her head, overwhelmed. "I don't know, Victor. This sounds big, too big." "It doesn't have to be," he said gently. "You take it one step at a time. A few performances, a few interviews. You decide how far you want to take it. But I'll be here to help." Sophia studied him, searching for any hint of ulterior motives. But his expression was open, his eyes steady. For once, she couldn't see the manipulative man she had feared at his parties. Instead, she saw someone who genuinely believed in her. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice quiet. Victor smiled, relief flickering across his face. "That's all I ask." The next few weeks were a blur of rehearsals, meetings, and moments of self-doubt. Victor stayed true to his word, helping her navigate the logistics of performances and publicity. He wasn't overbearing, nor did he push her beyond what she was comfortable with. Instead, he offered guidance when she needed it and stepped back when she needed space. Their relationship began to shift. The walls Sophia had built around herself started to crack, though she still held on to a measure of caution. Victor, for his part, seemed determined to prove that he wasn't the man he used to be. He listened more, spoke less, and slowly earned her trust. One evening, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Sophia found herself sitting on the steps of the conservatory, staring out at the city lights. Victor joined her, sitting a respectful distance away. "You're doing well," he said after a moment of silence. Sophia laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm barely holding it together." "Maybe," he said, "but even barely holding it together is better than not trying at all." She glanced at him, her expression softening. "Why are you doing this, Victor? Really?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Because I need to. For you, yes. But also for me. I've spent so much of my life tearing people down. Helping you. It feels like I'm finally doing something right." Sophia looked away, her thoughts swirling. She didn't know what the future held, for herself, for Emma, or even for Victor. But for the first time in years, she felt hope. And that was enough. The first major performance came on a crisp autumn evening. The hall was packed, the audience buzzing with anticipation. Sophia stood backstage, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for her cue. Emma was in the audience, seated in the front row, her face lit with pride. When the moment came, Sophia stepped onto the stage, the applause washing over her like a wave. She sat at the piano, her heart pounding. But as her fingers touched the keys, all her fear melted away. The music flowed, raw and powerful, carrying the story of her journey. It was a story of loss and rediscovery, of fear and courage, of falling and rising again. And as the final notes echoed through the hall, Sophia felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. Sophia bowed, her eyes brimming with tears. In the crowd she saw Emma, clapping wildly, and Victor, his expression one of quiet pride. This wasn't the end of her journey. It was the beginning. The final note. After the applause subsided and the lights dimmed, Sophia found herself standing alone in the quiet backstage corridor. The adrenaline from her performance had begun to fade, leaving her with a mixture of exhilaration and exhaustion. She leaned against the cool wall, her hands trembling slightly, but not from fear, from the overwhelming realization that she had done it. She had played her heart out and reclaimed a part of herself she thought was lost forever. A familiar voice broke the silence. "You were breathtaking." Sophia turned to see Victor standing a few feet away. He wasn't wearing his usual air of calculated composure. Instead, he looked genuine, almost humbled, as though witnessing her performance had moved him in ways he hadn't expected. "Thank you," Sophia said softly. "It still doesn't feel real." Victor took a step closer, his hands in his pockets. "It's real, and you deserve every moment of it." Sophia smiled faintly, the corners of her mouth trembling with the weight of everything she wanted to say but couldn't. "I couldn't have done this without you," she admitted. "But I still don't fully understand why you've done all this." "You've already apologized. You didn't owe me anything more." Victor hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor before meeting hers. "I think helping you was the first thing I've done in years that felt right, genuine. It wasn't about redemption, not entirely. It was about seeing someone shine after so much darkness. You gave me hope, Sophia. And that's something I hadn't felt in a long time." Sophia blinked, startled by the rawness of his confession. She had seen glimpses of this vulnerability before, but now it was laid bare. For the first time, she saw Victor not as a man of power and arrogance, but as someone who had been broken and was trying to rebuild himself, piece by piece. "I don't know where this will take me," Sophia said after a long pause. "But I do know that I'm not going back to who I was. And I think you're not either." Victor smiled, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. "No, I'm not. Thanks to you." The ride home that night was quiet but filled with unspoken warmth. Emma sat beside Sophia in the back seat of the car, clutching a bouquet of flowers one of the attendees had handed her. She had fallen asleep, her head resting on Sophia's arm, her tiny breaths steady and rhythmic. Victor had offered to drive them home himself, a gesture Sophia would have declined weeks ago, but now accepted without hesitation. He remained silent for most of the drive, letting the soft hum of the city night fill the space between them. As they pulled up to Sophia's apartment building, Victor turned to her. You're going to do great things, Sophia. I can feel it." Sophia looked at him, her heart full but heavy with the weight of everything they had shared. "And so will you, Victor, if you let yourself." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then Victor nodded, a faint smile on his lips. "Good night, Sophia." "Good night, Victor." Over the weeks that followed, Sophia's world transformed in ways she never thought possible. The performance at the conservatory opened doors she hadn't even known existed. She began teaching workshops at the local community center, inspiring young musicians who reminded her of herself at their age. Full of dreams, but unsure of how to chase them, she performed at small venues, charity events, and even a regional music festival, each experience reaffirming her newfound purpose. Victor continued to offer support from a distance, respecting the boundaries Sophia had set. They kept in touch occasionally, exchanging brief but meaningful updates. He seemed to be finding his own path, stepping back from the ostentatious lifestyle that had once defined him. He had started funding local arts programs, a quiet but impactful way of giving back. One evening, as Sophia sat at her piano, Emma curled up beside her. Drawing in a notebook, she reflected on how far they had come. The silence of the room was comforting, not oppressive, and the piano no longer felt like a relic of a lost dream. It was a bridge, a connection to the past, the present, and the future. "Mommy." Emma's voice broke through her thoughts. "Yes, sweetheart. Do you think I can play the piano like you someday?" Sophia smiled, pulling her daughter into her lap. "You can do anything you want, Emma. The world is wide open for you." Emma giggled, her small hands brushing the keys as she pressed a random note. "Will you teach me?" Sophia kissed the top of her head. "Of course I will." As the soft melody of a lullaby filled the room, Sophia felt a sense of peace settle over her. Life wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was hers. And for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Epilogue. Years later, Sophia stood backstage at a prestigious concert hall, the hum of an expectant audience filling the air. She was no longer a newcomer to the stage. She was an accomplished pianist, known for her evocative performances and her inspiring story. Beside her, Emma, now a teenager, adjusted the hem of her elegant dress. She was about to perform her first duet with her mother. "You ready?" Sophia asked, smiling down at her daughter. Emma nodded, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Always." As they stepped onto the stage together, the applause was deafening. Sophia glanced at the crowd, her gaze catching on a familiar face. Victor sat near the back, his expression proud but unobtrusive, a quiet constant in her journey. Sophia sat at the piano, Emma by her side. Their hands hovered over the keys, and as the first notes rang out, the music filled the hall, weaving a story of resilience, love, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and daughter. And as the melody soared, Sophia knew she had found her harmony.